Right, so today we're going to be talking about defense mechanisms, which are concepts initially identified by Freud and then further later developed by the psychoanalysts. Now, before we get into defense mechanisms, I think I should mention why it's a good idea that we should learn about them. In many cases, defense mechanisms work unconsciously without our knowing to distort our realities. Defense mechanisms are generally seen as unhealthy, but they can also be adaptive and allow us to function normally. But issues can arise when defense mechanisms are overused in order to avoid dealing with problems. In psychoanalytic therapy, the goal is to help the client uncover these unconscious defense mechanisms and find better, healthier ways of dealing with their anxiety and distress. So I think knowing about these defense mechanisms, bringing it to our conscious knowledge, being able to identify it within ourselves and others can be of use. So let's start by defining what a defense mechanism is. A defense mechanism is used to protect the mind against unwanted feelings, memories, and impulses that are too difficult for the conscious mind to cope with. It can protect the mind from overwhelming anxiety and distress. So there are actually a lot of defense mechanisms that have been identified and divided into different classifications, but I don't think I'll be able to talk about all of them in this video. So I thought we'd focus on the Neurotic classification, which consists of 5 different defense mechanisms. These 5 are repression, displacement, reaction formation, disassociation, and intellectualization. Now, to understand why these 5 are grouped under the Neurotic classification, I think it would be helpful to define what neurotic behavior is. Neurotic behaviors are emotional and physical reactions that are drastic and irrational. They're automatic and unconscious efforts to manage anxiety and distress. So let's start with the first defense mechanism, which is actually, I think, the most well known. That is repression. Repression acts to keep unwanted feelings and thoughts out of our conscious awareness. But the repressed thoughts or memories don't just disappear. In fact, they continue to influence our behavior. For example, a person who has repressed memories as a child of neglect and abuse may later find difficulties in forming healthy relationships. The repressed contents are still unconsciously influencing his behavior and thought patterns, and sometimes the repressed contents can even resurface. The second defense mechanism is called displacement. Displacement involves taking out our frustrations, feelings, and impulses on people or objects that are less threatening to us. Aggression can be a very good example of how displacement works. So, for example, expressing your anger to a person of authority might have negative consequences. So a person will express their anger on someone with less authority to them. Let me give an example. So a person has an argument with their boss, but he can't express that anger to his boss because it can lead to negative consequences. So when he goes home, he expresses this anger by shouting at maybe his wife or his kid, because his wife or kid doesn't pose a threat to him. I actually mentioned this a little bit in my previous video, where I mentioned a person who holds on to pain can express it by externally kind of projecting it onto others. The third defense mechanism is called reaction formation. Now, this one was a bit of a strange one. It was a little difficult for me to understand. Reaction formation reduces anxiety by taking up the opposite feeling or behavior. An example of this would be treating someone you dislike in an excessively friendly manner. Now, I found this very interesting because as soon as I learned about it, I could kind of remember moments in life where I saw this kind of behavior play out in others, and I wondered why we do this. Why would someone behave in an opposite manner to their true feelings? So according to Freud, they behave in this opposite manner and hide their true feelings in this way to avoid social punishment, which makes sense. Okay, I'm finding it a little bit difficult to give an example of this one. But I have seen a lot of times, like I mentioned in my life, where people will kind of behave really strangely in a friendly manner to someone they don't like. Okay, so the fourth defense mechanism is called disassociation, which is a temporary modification of one's personal identity to avoid emotional distress. It involves feeling disconnected from a stressful or traumatic event, or sometimes not even feeling like the event is happening. It's a way to block out mental trauma and protect the mind from this overwhelming stress. It leaves a person unable to remember traumatic events in their lives. People often dissociate. Why do I find it so difficult to pronounce that? People often dissociate when going through abuse. And I think dissociation is actually quite common in soldiers who have to witness a lot of tragedy. So there's another example which I think is to do with dissociation, but I'm not too sure. There's a story I read about how when Stephen King was young, he saw his friend get hit by a train and die, but Stephen King has no memories of the event. I believe this is dissociation, but I think it's also repression. And the fifth final neurotic defense mechanism is called intellectualization. Intellectualization works to reduce anxiety by thinking of events in a cold and clinical way. It allows us to avoid thinking of the emotional, which could be stressful aspect of the situation, and instead focus on the intellectual aspect of the situation. For example, if someone hurts you, you might focus on reasons for their behavior instead of focusing on the hurt. It can be a useful way to explain and understand negative events. So guys, those are the 5 defense mechanisms categorized under the neurotic classification. I hope I did a good job at explaining them. I'd love to further expand on the ideas of defense mechanisms. There's a lot more to explore, hopefully further down the line. Anyways guys, hope you learned something today, and I'll see you again in the next video.